In the early 1900s, one company dominated timber operations east of Springfield and deep into the Mohawk Valley of Lane County. It owned vast tracts of Douglas fir, miles of private logging railroad, massive mills in Springfield and Wendling, and dozens of rotating forest camps. By 1910, it employed hundreds of men in remote railroad logging camps, at times pushing payroll totals into the tens of thousands of dollars per month, according to contemporary Oregon reporting on mill output and operations. And according to available payroll reporting and documented regional accounts, this lumber company did not necessarily pay its workers in company scrip that was only redeemable at company stores within the camp. No, unlike most railroad logging camps in the early 20th century, they primarily paid their workers in U.S. legal tender cash. This company was the Booth-Kelly Lumber Company. There's a persistent myth about logging camps that workers were paid only in company scrip, which mainly were vouchers and tokens redeemable solely at company stores. That was true in some lumber regions in the upper Midwest and Appalachia. But for Booth-Kelly's Oregon logging operations, their woods workers were primarily paid in U.S. legal tender cash, not exclusively in scrip. Why does that matter? Because cash changes everything. On payday, men received lump sums after weeks of work. There was no bank in camp. The nearest town was miles away. Most men had nowhere to immediately spend their earnings. So, for at least one night per pay cycle, hundreds of dollars, sometimes thousands collectively, circulated inside camp, and that concentration of currency created opportunity. Like most industrial logging operations of the era, Booth-Kelly camps operated under rules designed to preserve order. Across the Pacific Northwest, logging companies commonly banned gambling, liquor, fighting. Similar camp rules preserved in regional archives state that gambling debts would not be recognized by the company, a clause that only exists when gambling is common enough to cause problems. But enforcement in deep timber country was another matter. Booth-Kelly's camps often lay miles from Springfield, accessible primarily and only by company rail. Lane County deputies did not casually patrol these forests. Supervisors focused on production. If men showed up at the landing at dawn ready to cut timber, what happened after midnight often stayed after midnight. Illegal poker games inside Booth-Kelly camps were not flashy saloon operations or chaotic free-for-alls. They were private, quiet, and controlled. They functioned according to informal but recognizable systems shaped by isolation, payroll timing, and camp hierarchy. Games were rarely open to the entire bunkhouse. Participation was typically controlled through quiet invitation. A small group of regular players, often men who had worked together for multiple logging rotations, formed the core. New participants were admitted based on personal familiarity, reputation for paying debts, skill level, and social standing within the crew. This wasn't about exclusivity for prestige. It was about risk control. In a remote camp, inviting the wrong man could mean unpaid gambling debts, violence, exposure to supervisors. Trust functioned as the primary security system. Games were typically hosted in abandoned bunkhouses left behind after a camp shift, storage sheds temporarily unused, occasionally in rail cars parked on spur lines. Isolation provided cover. Blankets over windows prevented lantern light from leaking. Doors were monitored. The deeper the camp, the safer the game. These games were not random. They were structured, usually organized by a respected faller or a rigging slinger with influence across bunkhouse cliques. His role wasn't necessarily to dominate the table, but to ensure disputes didn't spiral. Or a skilled, experienced player known for steady hands and for understanding betting patterns. This man might deal most hands and control the tempo of play. The organizer or host did not own the game in a formal sense, but he controlled who sat down, when the game began, the betting structure, the physical space. This control created subtle power. The organizer invited participants quietly, limited the table to trusted men, ensured a lookout was posted. The lookout's job was simple. If a supervisor approached, knock twice. If someone unfamiliar approached, knock hard and don't stop. Games could disappear in seconds. These were not penny games. Games clustered around predictable economic cycles. Most intense sessions occurred on payday evening, the night after payroll, or during weather delays when logging paused. On payday nights especially, entire weekly wages could be wagered. Side pots formed quickly. Credit sometimes extended informally. With no formal arbitration, trust was everything, but trust was fragile. Unlike town saloons, these games had no neutral dealer. Often the host dealt, and if the host won too frequently, suspicion followed. Historical accounts of Pacific Northwest logging camps show that the most common poker variants in the early 1900s lumber culture were 5-card draw and 5-card stud. Why these? Because they required one deck, minimal space, and simple rules understood by most laborers. Stud games were particularly popular in work camps because they required fewer complicated betting structures and allowed strong players to leverage psychology. Bluffing in camp mattered. Reading another man's face mattered. In a workforce built on physical strength, poker introduced a different hierarchy: mental dominance. Despite illegality, Poker dens operated under internal norms. No weapons at the table, no intoxicated dealing, and no overt cheating. Nevertheless, across early 20th century logging culture in Oregon and Washington, disputes over gambling in railroad logging camps like Booth Kelly were not uncommon. Regional historical records describe fights breaking out over accusations of marked cards, men beaten after refusing to pay debts, knives drawn during heated arguments. Inside Booth Kelly camps, similar tensions would have applied. These were exhausted men working 10 to 12 hours daily, living in cramped quarters, sleeping in shared bunkhouses. Add alcohol, which was also officially banned but frequently present, and the emotional volatility increased. Without a town marshal to mediate disputes, justice was immediate and physical. Because no neutral authority existed, games depended on collective enforcement. If someone refused to pay, consequences were immediate and social, often resolved before sunrise. A man caught manipulating the deck risked more than a losing hand. He risked permanent exclusion from camp games and possibly physical retaliation. In a closed environment like a Booth Kelly camp, exclusion carried weight. Social isolation in an already isolated setting was costly. The Booth Kelly Lumber Company was a large industrial operation with public visibility in Oregon business circles. Open scandal would have been unacceptable, but quiet card games? That was different. Company priorities were meeting timber contracts, keeping rail schedules intact, maintaining labor supply, and avoiding major disruptions. So, breaking up every illegal poker game would have required constant surveillance. Instead, a practical line likely existed. If gambling did not lead to injury, cause missed shifts, or spill into public scandal, it was tolerated unofficially. Productivity outweighed policing. One reason no dramatic newspaper raids appear in surviving Lane County reporting from this period is simple: secrecy. Men did not report card games. They did not invite deputies into camp, and camps were transient. By the time a complaint traveled from forest to town, the crew could already be miles deeper along the spur line. The forest erased evidence, and corporate record-keeping rarely preserved internal disciplinary incidents unless catastrophic. Security inside Booth Kelly's camps was practical, not theatrical. Common safeguards included posting a man outside as lookout, playing in structures slightly removed from central bunkhouses, and using low lantern light to prevent visibility. The deeper a camp sat along a spur line, the lower the probability of interruption. Inside a Booth Kelly camp, status during the day was determined by skill with an axe, efficiency on the landing, and endurance in bad weather. But at night, around a lantern-lit table, hierarchy shifted. A quiet man could dominate. A foreman could lose. A new hire could bluff a veteran out of half a month's pay. Poker created a parallel social order, one based on calculation, nerve, and risk. And in isolated male environments, those dynamics become powerful